Joining the show today, making his second appearance, national reporter with The Athletic, covering NHL draft prospects. Welcome back, Scott Wheeler.
Thanks for having me, fellas. It's you're catching me at the tail end of my month from hell, so I'm happy to be through the fog and out the other side, and now I get to turn my attention to the 2025 NHL Draft and sort of pivot away from the prospect pool rankings. So proud of the work, but happy to be done with it. It's a grind.
So just like small glimpse, don't have to go into all the detail, but what's the month of hell look like for Scott Wheeler?
Yeah, so the process for the prospect pool rankings really starts in November. I put together loose lists in November before I head off to selection camps for the World Juniors, try to get a bit of a head start on at least building out the top 15 for all 32 teams. I put it in a giant Google sheet for our editors, and then I start to rank the teams from 32 to 1. And then right in between selection camp for the World Juniors and the World Juniors themselves, that sort of week in December, right before Christmas that I have free, I try to get 4 or 5 or 6 of the 32 pool rankings written so that when I come back from the World Juniors, I don't have to write 32 of them in 32 days kind of thing. And I can give myself a bit of a cushion and a bit of a head start. Our editors also like to have them a few days early at the Athletic so that they can get them all ready. But it's from as soon as I get back from the World Juniors on January 6th every year, from January 6th through till today, February 7th, today's the last day, obviously, as we record this, it's every single day. Like it's literally 30 straight days of writing, no weekends. I don't see much of my wife and my kids. It's a grind. It's a ton of writing, obviously. Like you could fill a couple of books with the actual word count of the project. They're all about 5,000, 6,000 words each. But on top of that, it's video, it's conversations with scouts, it's conversations with their coaches and their general managers and their junior clubs and their pro teams in Europe and their coaches with their college teams. And it's really just making sure that I've got it right. And then right before it runs, I'll send it to a scout from within each organization and say, hey, is there anything in the list that really pops out at you as off? And if there is, maybe I'll revisit that ranking, or maybe I'll hold firm in where I'm at. But typically the message back is no, maybe a couple of minor tweaks here or there, but you're good to go. And then from that point, it's on to the next one.
So if anyone listening thought that Scott Wheeler just puts these lists together willy-nilly, clearly not the case. A lot goes into this, and I'm glad you came out the other side okay. Let's go to more of a sore subject quick. We all know how the fans feel. We've seen it on social media, but from Hockey Canada brass, from you and your colleagues, The Athletic, like, what's the general sentiment around just the current state of Hockey Canada after back-to-back World Juniors quarterfinal exits?
Well, I think they had a bit of a reckoning this year in Ottawa. It was interesting. Scott Salmon, the head of the program of excellence at Hockey Canada, did 2 press conferences. He did one in the day immediately after the tournament, the day after the tournament, with his head scout and his general manager, Pete Anholt and Al Murray. Obviously, Al Murray is a name that Joe would know from his Tampa days. He won a Stanley Cup with the Tampa Bay Lightning. In that presser, it felt like they hadn't really wrapped their head around how badly things had gone and some of the real issues that they'd had with their process, some of the selection in terms of players, but also the way that the team was operated and run and coached. And from top to bottom, I think they still hadn't really come to terms with what went wrong and how badly it went wrong. And then oddly enough, Scott Salmon, the very next day, sitting with Catherine Henderson, the new CEO of Hockey Canada, did a second presser, and in that presser took a lot more accountability. And I think after sitting on it and sitting on the way that they talked about the tournament in their first presser, he sort of came back around and said, look, this wasn't a tournament of what ifs, and we could have won it. I think there were some real flaws here with the way that we constructed the team. And so now it's on them heading into next year to make sure that they get it right, because they will have a stronger team. The Americans, after winning their first ever back-to-back golds, are expected to take a step back. They're going to be particularly thin down the middle after James Hagens. James Hagens will be back and will be their number one center at next year's tournament. But it is a bit of a weaker age group the next couple of years for USA Hockey than it has been the last couple of years. And so there's no excuses for Hockey Canada. They talked in the lead up to last year's tournament, talked a lot about how they were more prepared, how they'd returned to the World Junior Summer Showcase in Plymouth, how they'd named their coaching staff early, how they knew this age group better than any of the previous age groups when they'd had disappointing tournaments. And yet clearly they didn't know the age group, or maybe they knew the age group a little bit too well and they'd made up their mind on some of the wrong guys. So all of that sort of made this concoction. Then they weren't practicing and it took them too long to get guys into the right spots on the power play, and everything was just kind of out of whack for this Hockey Canada sort of team, if you will, maybe even more so than they were the year prior in Gothenburg, which I thought was a disaster in and of itself in Gothenburg. So now you cannot have it happen. It's unacceptable to have it happen twice, but it would be incomprehensible if Canada were to flame out for a third straight tournament next year. So now the pressure's on them to get it right. And they hinted at, we needed to bring more skill guys. We've got the most talented players. We should have the most talented team every year. And we've sort of I think they realized that they'd maybe shot themselves in the foot or handicapped themselves a little bit by trying to build too much of a roster built around penalty killers and energy guys and that kind of thing. Canada can dominate at this level just by bringing the most talented players. So I think we'll see, they're still going to bring role guys every year, but I think we'll see a little bit of a pendulum back the other direction towards some of the skill next year.
And you mentioned USA taking a step back, which is natural after winning back-to-back, gold medals. The guys can't stay there forever, right? A lot of key core pieces leaving that team. David Carl won't be coaching that team, so you have a new head coach and that kind of situation. But even if they take a step back, the tournament will be in Minnesota next year. Yep. Just what are the realistic chances, or what do I have to go right for them to be a third straight, if that's even possible?
Well, the big losses are the Boston College kids, other than James Hagens, right? Like Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard will not be on the top line as their top line wingers in next year's tournament. Danny Nelson, who was a really important player for them, won't be back. Oliver Moore, who's been a really important player in back-to-back World Juniors for them, won't be back. So you start to look at, okay, who's next? And they still will be a top team. They're going to have the advantage of playing on home ice, all of that. Cole Hudson was one of the best defensemen, best players, period, at this year's tournament and is eligible to return as a returnee. James Hagens should be one of, if not the best player at next year's tournament. James Hagens should be in the conversation for MVP of next year's tournament, I think. So there is still more there. There's more coming. You're going to have Brody Zeemer back. You're going to have Max Plante back. There are some really strong pieces still of that team, of that age group. Cole Eiserman will be back. Trevor Connolly will be back. They're still going to have plenty of skill. I think the biggest question for them will actually potentially be in net. They trusted Trey Augustine and really relied on Trey Augustine in the last couple of tournaments. Even this year, their backup, Hampton Slukinski, is a legit high-end prospect. And neither of those kids, due to age, will be back at next year's tournament. So you start to look ahead to who the goalies could be. And it's likely going to be Nick Kempf, I think is probably the front runner. He was the guy at the program for them. He's played well for them internationally. But Nick Kempf is not Trey Augustine, and he's not Spencer Knight, and he's not Hampton Slukinski, and he's not Dustin Wolf. Some of the goalies that they've had come through the program at the U20 level have been high-end types over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So they'll be a little bit weaker there. And then you start to wonder, who are the centers after James Hagens? And it's not a great group. I think you'll see potentially some wingers move to the middle. I could see a player like Teddy Stiga, who obviously scored the golden goal for them at this year's tournament. Teddy isn't a natural center, but I could see a player like him or Brody Zeemer potentially being asked to play center. Because there's not a lot there. This year's age group at the program is a really weak one. So the kids who are about to get drafted, who will be potential 18-year-olds for next year's team, aren't high-end types. They like LJ Mooney. They like William Moore. They like Cole McKinney, but those aren't top World Junior players, especially as 18-year-olds. So it'll be interesting to see how they fill out their roster. But still, with Cole Hudson, with we'll see about Zeev Buium. I would expect that Zeev Buium's playing in the NHL and isn't a part of it, but technically Zeev would be eligible to return next year. But even without Zeev, Cole Hudson, James Haggins, Cole Iserman, Trevor Connolly, like those are going to be among the most skilled players in the tournament. So they should absolutely be in the mix for gold or in the mix for a medal next year. No question.
For sure. And we've got a lot of, Gopher following here. So kicking off some of the 2025 draft talk, got to ask you, especially since, I don't think I would want to ask Corey Pronman what he thinks about LJ Mooney. But you might give us a little bit more favorable read. Like, what do you see from him? I know he's been in and out of the lineup, but do you think this is a guy that's looking at first, second round, or is he going to drop further just because of his size?
Well, the day after this podcast released, my next top 64 list for the upcoming draft will be released at The Athletic. And I have LJ as a late second still. I thought his ranking through NHL Central Scouting, I think he was like 201st or something in North America. I thought that was insulting, frankly. And I know in talking to some people at the program that they also thought it was insulting relative to some of the players on their own team at the program who were ranked in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s kind of thing. I still think he gets picked. The challenge with LJ is obviously the size. He just hasn't gotten bigger. People were hoping that he was going to get bigger. He comes from a family of people who are all honestly on the shorter side. He's obviously cousins with Logan Cooley, and even Logan only got to sort of 5'10", 5'10.5". But very, very good player at this level, I think is the important piece to remember. He has played center and the wing for them. They've kind of moved him a little bit more to the wing this season as he hasn't been fully healthy, and the wing is sort of an easier route for him to get back into the mix. But he was a very good center for them as an underager who was called up to play at U18 Worlds last year. I think he'll be potentially one of the centers for Team USA as an 18-year-old at next year's World Juniors. Excellent skater. Like, he's one of the best skaters in the draft. Tons of skill, plays with detail, supports the puck well. But you see him in real life and you run into him around the rink, and he is every bit as small as his listing, and not just small in height, but he's a skinny kid who looks like a baby a little bit. So the hope for me is if you're drafting him in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, which I think is probably the range that he belongs, though he may go in the 6th or 7th round. If you're drafting him in the middle rounds, the hope is that if he can even get to 5'9" and 175 pounds, then you might have a player, or at the very least, he'll be a good AHLer because of how he skates and his ability to make plays and how detail-oriented he is and how well-rounded he is. And then on top of that, he can play center and he can play the wing. Will he get out-muscled in the face-off circle? All of those things are going to have to sort themselves out over time. And he's going to be a 4-year college player, I would expect, and sort of really work on adding muscle and getting stronger in the gym and that kind of thing in college. But I'm a big fan of LJ. I love the way he plays. And certainly at this stage, like, he's a top player in this age group. That doesn't mean he's a top prospect for the NHL in this age group. But when you see him on the ice with his peers, like, he's normally one of the better players on the ice.
Very fair. Okay. So quick hit then, just a more holistic, early lookings for the whole draft class. We kind of do something on our prospect show, adjacent here on the network, called Judd's Buds. Our guy Spoke Z. He does a way too early rankings, which is somewhere between August and October. Then after World Juniors, we do the kind of early rankings, and then we'll kind of trickle it in throughout up to the draft.
Yep.
He kind of gave 2 tiers for the top 10. He's got 4 guys that kind of interchangeable, but he's got them ranked. And then the 5 through 10, also kind of another tier, but he's got them in his order. I just want to see if anything stands out to you as being way off or something you'd interject on. So his top 4, he's got Schaefer, Haggins, Misa, Martone.
Yep.
Do you think there's anyone else that deserves to be in the conversation for that top 4 current state, or is that pretty much the solidified group?
Well, there are 2 sort of players at the fringes of that are interesting. One is Caleb Desnoyers, who teams now view as a top 5 guy, and many teams view in the same conversation, not with Schaefer, but with the 3 forwards after Schaefer. There are a lot of teams that would make a case that Caleb Desnoyers is every bit as strong an NHL prospect as those kids are. I have Caleb 5th on my upcoming list, so Caleb is sort of one spot below that group of 4 that you just mentioned. I think those, in Misa and Hagens' case, they're just better skaters. They're more skilled. They're more prolific offensively. There's just more power play upside and that kind of a thing. But Desnoyers is a 6'1.5" center who's been one of the best players on one of the best teams in the CHL this season, and is debatably one of the 2 or 3 best players in the QMJHL this season as a draft eligible. He's a very well-rounded player. The belief is that he's going to be an excellent 2-way second line center in the NHL. And that may have more value than a winger, for example, even if a winger is playing on the first line kind of thing. Like if he's an all situations, penalty kill, power play, 5-on-5, 6'1" center, 2-way type who's still productive, that's a very valuable player. So Desnoyers in that mix. And then the other one who won't go in that mix because of the injury question, but coming into this season, there were some who believed that Roger McQueen of the Brandon Wheat Kings belonged in that group. Now McQueen is dealing with a back issue that has bothered him really for 2 years now, since early on in his last season entering the draft. And he hasn't played a lot of hockey this season. He's been out since he had a very, very strong start despite dealing with the back injury in the WHL, and then decided to shut it down and get healthy and try to get the back sorted rather than playing through it. But he's kind of the X factor, because he might not even be a top 10 pick if there are still questions about his draft. And if he can't get back in time to play some more hockey, and he's going to be a topic of conversation, a lot like Caden Lindstrom, who obviously is still dealing with his back issue, but the Columbus Blue Jackets decided to take 4th overall in last year's draft regardless. McQueen kind of fits into that same range. Had he been healthy, I think McQueen would have been potentially right there with those kids. He's a 6'5", 6'6" center with a ton of skill and a pretty rare makeup. So those are kind of the two wild cards are Desnoyers and McQueen. But I do still think that 4 is the clear 4 at the moment.
Okay. No, that's very fair. And do you have something, Joe? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, I know you mentioned you're wrapping up the rankings and everything like that. The Wild number 2, only team in the playoff team with the top 5. What stood out to you looking at this overall class? It kind of surprises maybe people that they have this kind of class, considering the picks. They haven't had top 10 ones in a while. Just what stands up to make out of this group, and maybe what kept it from being number 1 in your mind?
This interview is brought to you by our friends at Waggle Golf. Waggle Golf believes what you wear on the course should reflect your individuality, who you are, where you're from, your hobbies, interests, and passions. All the stuff that makes you, well, you. That's why every design is inspired by the desire to create a piece of apparel that strikes a chord when you see it, that makes you say, wow, that was made for me. Because in a lot of ways, it was. Ready to get your Waggle on? Go to getyourwaggleon.com, throw in promo code SP10 at checkout to take 10% off your entire order.
Well, I think I've talked about a little bit about it with you offline, but I think the big thing that kept them from being number 1 was that Jesper has had a tough year. I think if Wallstedt had continued to progress and had a really solid year in the AHL and had a .915 save percentage and was making stops and keeping them in games and that kind of a thing, I think that could have potentially put them sort of more firmly in the first overall, or in the number 1 slot, if you will. For this year's prospect pool rankings. I still, as you guys both know, if you've followed my work, I'm still a big believer in Wallstedt. I like a lot of what I see in Wallstedt. I do think over the course of the last couple of years, there have emerged at least some question marks about his speed in the net and his mobility. And he's a little bit of a heavier guy, and his fitness and that kind of a thing. I don't think he's the quickest goalie, but outside of the quickness piece of it, and maybe him needing to get into a little bit better shape, Wallstedt's a very, very technically sound goalie. He's got good hands. He covers the lower third of the net with his pads well. He gets up and down in his butterfly fine. He plays sharp angles, really sort of technically high-end goalie in that way. And has always, I used to refer to him as kind of like a robot goalie. Like he was just always in the right spots and just made the saves. And now you've started to see it break down a little bit more when he needs to play quicker and be quicker post to post in the net and on scrambles and that kind of a thing. But I do still think he gets there. I do still think he's going to be a very good NHL goalie. The track record is still really strong, but that was kind of maybe the one thing that's holding them back, because otherwise with the addition of Jiricek, you've now got two of the top young D prospects in the sport, plus Brock Faber, who obviously is nowhere close to being a factor for this list anymore. But Brock Faber is a young core piece of that blue line. Part of it is in terms of them being number 2 is that I'm a huge believer in Zeev. I think Zeev is, and my top by now, my top 100 prospect pool ranking will be out at the Athletic. So I can say that Zeev was number 2 on that list, right behind Ivan Demidov as in terms of the top 100 NHL prospects. So just a big believer in Zeev. I think Zeev's going to be a star in the NHL. I think he's going to take over on that first power play from Brock Faber and be a stud. A guy who plays 25 minutes a night and has 60 points in the NHL in a season kind of thing. Like I do think that's the caliber of player that we're potentially talking about here. I think Jiricek's got a chance to be a really strong piece for them if he can sort out the footwork and the mobility and sort of work on his skating a little bit more. Yurov is a legit player, and the move from wing last season to center for Yurov has sort of really changed his projection for me. Obviously had a brilliant season last year at center in the KHL, has been a little bit less productive this season, but looks like he's going to be a second line center now. And that's a big deal for the Wild. So big believer in Yurov. I like Ohgren. I like Khusnutdinov. Charlie Stramel has taken a step this year after reuniting with Adam Nightingale, his head coach previously from the NTDP, and making the transfer from Wisconsin. I think that's been really important. There's some other guys sort of a little further down, Ryder Ritchie and others who I think have a chance. But that's the core of their group. I still think Riley Height's got a real good opportunity to be a solid NHL player and a power play 2 guy and that kind of a thing. So a lot to like about their pool, but it starts with Zeev and Jiricek and Yurov, and maybe Wallstedt if he can sort of reestablish himself. I know Iowa isn't a strong team defensively in front of Wallstedt, so I think the numbers are at least partly to do with that. But they weren't a great team in front of him defensively last year in Iowa either, and he was better last year than he's been this year. So Wallstedt's kind of the X factor of the group, but I really like Yurov and Zeev and Jiricek, and then obviously they've already got Ohgren and Khusnutdinov playing in the NHL and sort of finding their way as well.
Nice. And you mentioned before, like, very thorough process where you kind of want to check yourself before you post anything. When you went to the Wild and others, like, were there any that they had to check you on? Like, were there any big changes you made at the end?
No, not on the Wild pool. I went to the Wild about this last week and sort of no comments back from them, honestly, about this list in terms of the 1 to 15. I also asked them about some of the guys that I'd left off. So Ryan O'Rourke wasn't on the list. Jack Pert wasn't on the list. Caedan Bankier wasn't on the list. Callum Parker wasn't on the list. Rasmus Kumpalainen, who signed, wasn't on the list. Sebastian Soini, who they took in the 4th round in last year's draft and is a top player in the Finnish age group that he's a part of, wasn't on the list. So I sort of sanity checked all of that past them. Aaron Pionk was sort of the last guy on my list. So I sort of asked them, would you have Bankier over Pionk and that kind of a thing? And the answer was that I sort of had it in the right spot. So Bankier was the one who was kind of that. If the list went to 16, I think Caedan would have been the next player. I've got time for Kumpalainen, but he's really slow, and I've never been able to wrap my head around that. Very well-rounded center. He's got size, but he's really, really slow. So Kumpalainen, I think if he can work on the footwork and the pace of his game, could be a 4th-line center in the NHL potentially someday, in which case he belongs on the list, but I'm just not sold on him getting there and getting sort of into better shape and getting a little bit quicker. And then O'Rourke is another one that just feels... At this point, I think Ryan O'Rourke's probably tops out as a number 8, number 9 defenseman. Like, he's probably more of just a call-up guy rather than an everyday guy.
What do you think of Bankier overall? I know you mentioned number 16, but is he a guy, like, what do you think about his game, and do you think he can play bottom of 6 NHL minutes?
Yeah, I think he's got a chance to. I had a lot of time for him when he was in the WHL. He obviously was a surprise inclusion on the Canadian World Junior team a couple of years ago and had a really nice run there where he became a 90-point guy in the WHL, and he got signed and he played for Canada at the World Juniors, and he just seemed to be on a really strong path. He hasn't been able to make the same kind of impact at the AHL level as he did at the junior level. He's never been the strongest skater. It's something I've talked with him about over the years and something that I think he's aware that he needs to work on. He's also, despite being a fairly tall kid, isn't the biggest or strongest kid. So he doesn't kind of fit that natural checker role, but he hasn't scored enough in the AHL to get promoted as kind of a power play 2 guy or a middle 6 guy. And so I think he's kind of caught in that little bit of an in-between, but he's a well-rounded player. He can play all 3 forward positions. Coaches have always seemed to trust him. He does have some scoring, like he's got a good shot and he's got some skill. I think the question with Bankier has always just been, what is he in the NHL? Like, can he be a third line guy? And is a coach going to want him as the kind of player that they fit onto a fourth line? He's not really that sort of physical, overpowering forechecking type, but he's also not maybe a skill guy. And so he kind of always fit into that in between. Could he play at 5-on-5 in the NHL in a game tomorrow and hold his own? I think absolutely. But I do wonder whether he just kind of becomes a 13th, 14th, 15th forward kind of thing.
Okay. And there's a couple guys on here that I think Wild fans will be very pleasantly surprised with. Some still just don't know what to make of Jiricek. So him up at 3 is awesome. Charlie Stramel, obviously resurgent year. Aaron Pionk, especially on the back half of, since the holidays, he's looked awesome. The one guy that I see on here that I feel like fans are either going to push back on or be worried that they've fallen off. What can you tell us about Hunter Haight? Is this more indicative of other players rising, or has he shown you things this year that make you hesitant?
No, I actually think Hunter's had a really solid first season at the pro level in the AHL. He's been a very respectable player for them. He spent time on both of their special teams. He's played at center and stuck around at center. I think Hunter's had a solid season. I actually think what downgraded Hunter for me was actually last year. I had a conversation with Height entering last season and the staff in Saginaw, and their goal for him entering last season in the OHL was for him to be a 100-point player in that league. And he finished as a 60-something point player in that league. Now, they were very deep. They went out and acquired Owen Beck at the deadline. They had Matthias Sapovaliv down the middle. They had 3 of the top centers in the OHL last year. And so it became a little bit harder for Height to be the guy and to be the number 1 power play guy and to hit that 90 to 100 point range in his final season in the OHL. He was still a very good player for them. He was an important part of a team that won the Memorial Cup for them. There's a lot to like about Height and the junior career that he ended up having, especially after the trade to Saginaw, which sort of rejuvenated him after he had a very tough time post-draft in Barrie, sort of trying to take a step. The challenge with Height is skates well, good skill, smart player, well-rounded player, but he's a 5'10.5", 5'11" center, and the skill has never popped. He's never been a top offensive player in his age group or a really sort of star offensive player at any level he's played at. And so what is he as a 5'10.5", 5'11" center if all of his tools are good but not great? I've got a lot of time for him. Everybody who's ever coached him has had a lot of time for him. I know the Minnesota Wild have a lot of time for him. But I think ultimately it's going to be hard for him to carve out a niche as a full-time NHLer. Will Hunter Height play games in the NHL? I think he will. Is he going to be an 82-game player, or is he the kind of guy who plays 30 games for you a year and then is in the AHL the rest of the time kind of thing? I think that's what they have to figure out. And it's going to be challenging for him with Khusnutdinov and some of the other young players that they're also trying to incorporate. And once Yurov comes over, there's another roster spot, another guy who's ahead of Hunter Height on the totem pole. It might be a little tricky for him to earn minutes with them at the NHL level, I think.
And as you follow the Wild for a long time, you've noticed that the center position has been an intriguing and frustrating one for them for their whole existence, basically. And I still wonder if they do have a true number 1 center on their roster right now. Like Rossi's been great the last couple of years. He's really done everything they've asked him to do. Eric Sinek, obviously a valuable 2-way player. That's where Yurov to me comes in. And I know you mentioned probably a second line center in the NHL. Maybe their number 1 center comes from free agency with all the money they're going to have, but where do you see
maybe
that
you can
dynamic?
win? Maybe you can win with 3 second line centers, right? Maybe that's the path for them.
No, very much too. You just think of other guys in their division, like McKinnon, and you look in the West with McDavid, and everybody has that guy that, playoff time, right? Who's going to match up other than the blue line, which will be great. But so you see Yurov logically probably is more of a second line guy, second line center, versus being the alpha number 1 kind of thing eventually.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of Yurov is that he played left wing and right wing all the way up. So maybe he's a second line center or a first line winger, right? Like maybe he makes the move back to the wing, even though his best hockey, I believe, has been played at the best hockey of his career has been in the last 2 years, and especially last year. And he played it entirely at center. So I do think center really works for Yurov. He's an incredibly smart player. He understands where to be on the ice and how to use time and space to his advantage. He can play with a variety of line mates. But the beauty of Yurov is that maybe he is that guy like Leon Draisaitl's is an entirely different monster, but Leon has often played on the first line wing with Connor McDavid when they've needed to. And then he's been their second line center at other times. And he's been their first line center. And they've kind of had 2 first line centers in Ottawa. Very different situation here, but maybe Yurov can elevate and play on your first line on the wing when you need him to. And then he can be a second line center type when you need him to. Maybe he gets to first line center status. I do think that would be a bit of a surprising outcome. Like, I think he's more likely a second line center than a first line center. I think he's more likely a 50 to 60 point player than a 70, 80 point player. But would it be completely out of the question for him to have a season like that at some point in his career? Could he be a 50 point guy every year and then have a season or two where he's a 70 point guy with the right line mates? I think that's possible for Danila. I think he's going to be a heck of a player and surprise some people. And I think had they been a part of the World Juniors over the last few years, and had we been able to see more of him internationally in a best on best setting, I think there would be a lot more excitement in North America about who Danila Yurov is as a prospect.
Very fair. Joe, do you have anything else, or did we want to wrap on the final question?
I was going to ask about Khusnutdinov, because he's on your list. Obviously, he's an NHL player, could probably be on or off it. And I'm sure you don't watch them every day, but the last 4 or 5, 6 games, he's really started to come on and like be a little more of a force, like, aggressive, offensively, physical. And I think I agree with you in your write up, where there are times I thought he could be in Iowa and it could benefit him. Right. Yeah. I don't know if that's actually going to happen or not, but where do you see him as a player, and like, is this kind of what his role probably will be in the NHL as far as like fourth line, third line center, or is there more upside there than, I know fans are always like, you should move him up. I'm like, well, there's other guys ahead of him, and like maybe he fits better because he's playing that role minutes.
I think ideally he becomes a really productive 40-point third line center. I don't think he's a fourth line center long term. I think he's more talented than that. I think he's smarter than that. The work ethic has always been there. He's always sort of earned the trust of his coaches. He plays hard. He's a smart player. I don't think the skill is high end. Like, I don't think you'll ever see him on PP1 kind of thing. But could he become a PP2 guy who contributes regularly at 5-on-5 and is an important part of a winning team? Absolutely. Could he become a $3.5-4 million player in the NHL who's a solid third line center? Absolutely. So I think that's what you have to be working towards and building towards with Marat, is sort of elevating him eventually at the right time, elevating him from sort of fourth line usage and playing 10 minutes a night to eventually playing 14, 15 and a half minutes a night. I think that's the path for him.
You kind of have Stramel in a third line center role too, right? You have Stramel kind of in that similar, different players, but you have in the similar like slot probably,
Yeah, and if Stramel ends up as a fourth line center, I think that's a good outcome for him as well. Not all of these guys need to be playing high in a lineup for them to be having an impact. If he becomes an excellent fourth line center, even as a first round pick, I think that's a respectable outcome that you can live with. So, and he looks very different than Khusnutdinov. So if that's your 3-4C of the future, they offer something completely different. Stramel's, they call him the big rig. Like, he's just a big boy. He's heavier over pucks. He's got that size and strength to him. Khusnutdinov relies more on his know-how and his smarts and right place, right time and work ethic and that kind of a thing. But I think that could be the solid foundation of something. Now, is that it? Let's say it's Yurov or Rossi, and then Khusnutdinov, and then Stramel, and that's the future. Is there a path for all of those guys to be a part of the team when they're all going to remain fairly young for the next few years? Are they going to want to spend money elsewhere? Where does Joel Eriksson Ek fit into it? Are they going to spend money in free agency once Suter and Parise fully come off the books? All of those things are things that they're going to grapple with. The cap's going up. There's going to be money to spend. And as a result, not all of those guys are going to play. Riley Height is also a center. We have to remember, right? Like, it's not all of these guys are going to make it, and that's okay. but I think most of them feel like they're on the right path. And obviously in Khusnutdinov and Ohgren's case, they're already starting to contribute.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of guys that can go up this way, but you've been really bullish on Zeev, which I've watching him a lot. I think, that'll be, I don't know if it's him and Faber going forward or how they mix that pairings up, but I don't know if he can I don't know if he can have the same impact that maybe Faber did right away. Maybe they're different kind of players. I don't know if you see that. Like, maybe kind of unfair to expect him to come in and be right in the playoffs and then next year be Faber.
I try to always temper my expectations and not get carried away. And I try not to fuel the fire with fans, but I truly believe that Zeev's ready to come in and contribute this spring once his season at Denver's over and play in the playoffs and be a good player right away. Now, is he going to play 30 minutes like Brock Faber did as a rookie? Probably not, but no, I can't remember the last time a defenseman other than Brock Faber, and although Lane Hudson has played some pretty ridiculous minutes this year, but even like Aaron Ekblad wasn't playing those minutes. Rasmus Dahlin wasn't playing those minutes. Owen Power did right away play 24, 25 minutes a night in Buffalo. But I could Zeev Buium next year play 20 minutes a night for them and then you've got Faber playing 26, 27 and Zeev slots in immediately on your second pairing and immediately on one of your two power plays. I absolutely think he's capable of being that kind of a player right away.
Fans are going to take that and run. Oh, that's awesome. Well, really appreciate the time, Scott. Final question. I know we already did your Waggle golf foursome, but different spin on it this week. Everyone go to getyourwaggleon.com, throw in promo code SP10, take 10% off your entire order. Hats, polos, quarter zips, you name it. Get over there. I'm going to let you choose one of two paths. We're either going to go with athletic employees or wild prospects. You're going to put together a list of 4 that would make the best golf foursome just on talent.
Oh, the best golf foursome. I've played golf with a few people at the Athletic, actually, in Traverse City a couple of years ago. A few of us went out. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the golf game looks like in terms of any of the prospects, really. I'll go for what would be a fun foursome from Athletic colleagues on the course. I've played a lot of golf with Dom. We played together in Toronto here over the summer a few times and had a ton of fun out on the course with Dom. So I'll throw Dom in there. I'll throw my good friend Haley Salvian in there. Haley's a really good pal of mine, and we've been friends for a long time. So I'll throw her into the mix. And then I've heard that Jesse Granger went out with Ian Mendez and a couple of colleagues in Vegas at the draft this year. And word through the grapevine was that Jesse pounds it 300 yards and can absolutely really smack the golf ball. So I'll throw Jesse in there. If we're playing best ball, maybe Granger can carry us.
Okay. I like that. Is there anyone you want to throw under the bus? Is this is someone that should not be anywhere near this list.
No. I've played with Boltman a little bit. Boltman's a fine golfer. Nobody. I played with Shapiro's no longer a colleague, but I've played golf with Sean Shapiro, former Athletic colleague, and nobody I need to throw under the bus.
Okay, fair enough. Just have to offer it. It's a good list. We like it. And appreciate you coming on a second time. Hopefully there'll be more. I know there'll be plenty to talk about around draft time. You're always welcome back on. I mean, as a recurring guest, you're kind of obligated to just come whenever we throw the bat signal now, but really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Get some rest now that the month from hell is over, at least for another couple of weeks before the draft prep gets going. So
yeah, I got to finish up this draft ranking, and then my wife and I are actually headed down to Scottsdale at the beginning of March to play some golf and get some time away. It'll be our first trip with no kids, so we're looking forward to sort of both celebrating our 30th birthdays this year, and we're gonna head down to Scottsdale for 5 or 6 days. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, enjoy it, man. Have a lot of time, have a lot of fun, and thanks again for joining us and talking prospects and everything. So appreciate it.
Yep. Cheers, guys.